Yeah, it's definitely that time of day. It's so tired. I definitely feel like I'm ready for bed now. Like it's my body clock is one for sure. All right.
Sí, gracias. Tengo que poner
I know that. Yeah. I just like that. And for real stuff, yeah.
No.
No, I agree. I was trying to map out what you were saying. So something is not is really good. There's usually different. It's not word.
Yeah.
And then you might sit down and well, actually, in the case of confidence, and isolate action which we
yeah.
If there's any it's what else is coming out, and so
Ontological status of Stoic.
Thanks, Ricardo, and thanks for the invitation to the conference that I'm very much enjoying. So the ontological status of Stoic lecta is the object of significant scholarly controversy, as we have been seeing. What is uncontroversial, I think, is that lecta are incorporeal entities, and that since, according to the Stoics, only what is corporeal exists, lecta cannot exist, but rather subsist, euphystanai, like space, void, and time, the other incorporeals. There is extensive debate on the origin and motivation of the Stoic introduction of sayables or lecta, on the rationale for claiming that they are incorporeal, and on the question whether sayables, although different both from thoughts and from linguistic signifiers, are somehow dependent on them, and therefore subsist only as long as the thought or linguistic expression saying them do, the kind of view that Jose was trying to defend, or are rather mind-independent and language-independent entities which are out there to get said, whether or not they're actually thought or said by anyone, or even more strongly are fundamental parts of the basic furniture of Stoic reality, entities like state of affairs, on a pair with bodies, and complementary and interdependent with bodies. This is very rough kind of description of some of the positions in the debate. The question of this ontological status of lecta requires, I think, careful nuancing to avoid conflating different positions. It's one thing to claim that the subsistence of lecta depends on the existence of certain thoughts and linguistic expressions which signify them, whether at some time or at any given time. A different thing is to say that sayables subsist only insofar as there is some language and rational being which can signify them, even if many of them will never be expressed and perhaps could never be expressed by beings with finite capacities. And yet another to claim that sayables would subsist even if there were no language and no thinker at all. And even further, yet another to claim that the subsistence of all or some of the sayables is not only dependent of language and thought, but does not even supervene upon the existence of corporeal objects and qualities either, kind of thing that Bronowski has argued. So today we'd like to explore a kind of less studied, but I think complementary set of questions, which might perhaps help to shed some light also on some of these other issues. And the questions are, well, what is the ontological status of Stoic logoi or Stoic arguments? Is there anything at all interesting to say about them, the arguments, since we know that they are themselves lecta and compounded from lecta? What consequences did the Stoic conception of lecta have on their conception of what an argument is? Is what we know about the Stoics' analysis of certain types of argument consistent with the view that arguments are simply systems of incorporeal lecta on any interpretation of what lecton is? And finally, from examining some aspects of the Stoic logic of arguments, can we learn anything valuable about the ontology of arguments? And perhaps thereby, in a kind of indirect way, about the ontology of their components, the lecta. This is very much work in progress. I have many more questions than answers. In fact, I don't really have any answer at the moment, just some hypotheses that I would like to put there and test. So, the first key subdivision of Stoic dialectic, which is a part of logic, is between signifiers and things signified. That we take for granted, as others have done, kind of basic knowledge of this distinction. In the area of signifiers, I would like just to remind ourselves that among the kind of articulate utterances called lexes, called expressions, there are some which are signifying, and those are those issues from the thought of the speaker, and only these count as logos, as speech. There are some articulate expressions, some lexes like blituri, that do not signify anything, so do not count as speech, and neither do the articulate and signifying sounds emitted by parrots or a hi-fi system count as logos, as speech, since they are not manifestations of thoughts. On the side of the things signified, the phenomena by human speech, logos are the lecta, incomplete or self-complete. Sometimes these are called pragmata. Our sources propose several lists of these, and these include things like axiomata, assertibles, the kind of thing, a saying which we make an assertion, which can be either true or false. And the three main types of assertibles, namely conditional disjunction and negative conjunction, are the foundation of the Stoic syllogistic theory, because they form the main leading premises of the 5 indemonstrable syllogisms. But syllogisms are just a species of arguments. They are valid arguments which have a certain structure, a certain logical form. But what is a logos? What is an argument more general, the genus? Text T1 to T4 on the handout offer a first characterization of what a logos is for the Stoics. I won't read them. You find them on the handout. According to this text, an argument is some incorporeal lecton itself. We know from our sources that the parts of the things which are the arguments are made of are typically assertibles, but not always assertibles. So there are arguments which are made of other types of lecta, for example, hypotheses. And so far, things seem to be relatively uncontroversial. I think just noticing a couple of points, though. One first thing to just point out is that a logos, an argument, is a lecton, is a thing signified. We will see in a second that is specifically a system of lecta. So it's not a logos. A logos is not a logos for the Stoics. A logos is a signifier, is speech, is significant speech, whereas a logos argument is a thing signified. So we have here an interesting case of ambiguities. Often the Stoics have situations in which they have a term which is employed for the genus and for the species, but here actually logoi as arguments are not species of logos, because a logos, again, is on the side of utterance and signifiers. Another thing to notice is that if you have this conception of logos, all the things written on my handout are not arguments, because clearly they are not incorporeal lecta, but they are signifiers, linguistic expressions which signify something, but they are not themselves arguments. This might seem a bit strange, but if you think of the Aristotelian conception of what an argument is, actually, well, what I wanted to say actually is the opposite, that this might not seem to be strange, that arguments are these abstract entities. But, for example, in Aristotle, we get a different picture of what an argument is. It's a set of logoi, and logoi that are understood as sentences. So thinking of it with Stoic language more on the side of signifiers. And quite interestingly, we see that arguments and syllogisms, which are species of arguments, are not only things signified and pragmata, but are themselves sayables. They are not only compounds of sayables, but they are themselves put in the list of complete sayables as such. So let's make a bit more progress with some texts, T5 and T7, which give us some more information about what a logos, an argument, is. We read T5 and T6. An argument is what is constituted out of premises and conclusions. We call premises not only any posits that we help ourselves to, but those that the person we are debating with grants and accepts. And the conclusion is what is established by means of the premises. For example, an argument is this whole compound. If it is day, it's light, but it's day, therefore it is light. Its premises are, if it is day, it is light, and but it is light, and the conclusion is, therefore it is light. Sextus Empiricus has something similar when he says that an argument is a compound of premises and conclusions. The assertibles assumed with agreement for the establishment of the conclusion are called premises. The assertible established from the premises is the conclusion. So being made of certain self-complete lecta, typically, but not always axiomata, is not actually a sufficient condition for being a logos. For the Stoic, an argument is not just any set of lecta, it is a system of them, and one made specifically of premises and conclusion. And the premise is not any lecton, it's one that is assumed for the purpose of establishing the conclusion. There is here the etymological connection between the lemmata and lambanein. And the conclusion is not any old assertible either. It's something that is purportedly established by the premises or from the premises. Premises and conclusion are relational terms. Certain premises are sayable accepted for or towards a certain conclusion, and the conclusion is a sayable supposedly established from the premises. And assuming something and establishing something are acts performed by rational agents. Something cannot be an assumption without someone assuming it, and something cannot be established without someone establishing it. And that's not enough. In fact, the premises must have been granted or considered by the dialectical interlocutor. This characterization of premises is really extremely narrow, seems in fact to be too narrow, since arguments and the species and subspecies like syllogisms and apodeixis, demonstrations, clearly can also be employed in non-dialectical contexts. I gave you a quotation from Bobson, noticing that clearly here we have evidence that the Stoic theory of arguments is still embedded in the dialectical practice of conducting arguments by question and answer. But since the definition precludes more than the subsistence of any unthought or unproposed arguments, apparently, but even the existence of any non-dialectical arguments is worth wondering whether this narrow definition of what the premises and the conclusion are shouldn't be taken too seriously as the last word on the Stoic on what a logos is. The fact that the logos as a structure is not only introduced by the relational account of premises and conclusion, but also expressed by the choice of the term systema. A system is something more than a mere set of collection or items, even an order set, even a compound or aggregate of things. We know that for the Stoics, techne, an expertise, is a systema of catalepsis. Aletheia is a system of knowledge of truth. Episteme is also a system of catalepsis. And a city, both a human city and a cosmic city, is also a systema. All these are things which are very complex structures in which the parts are not simply put together as kind of random collection. In fact, you can notice that this report used the act plus genitive rather than simply the genitive partitive. It's not a systema of something, but it's a system made out of some things, premises and conclusions. So John Pans has said that Stoic arguments are defined as systemed or ordered sets of assertibles, but I think that ordered set is something too weak to capture what the Stoics want to say. We will see later that actually sometimes he wants to argue even more strongly that they are not even ordered sets. But even if you think of these as an order, 1, 2, 3, what you find on the handout is clearly not an argument, because although the 3 propositions have a certain order, clearly they're not presented with the structure. For example, there is no evidence here that it is light is supposed to be the conclusion. Related to this, should be noticed that ara, therefore, is presented by our sources as part of the conclusion. Interestingly, Annas and Barnes, when they translate the Sextus passage, don't translate it. The translation is, for example, in the following argument, it is light, is the consequence, and the rest are the assumption. But the text says, ara, therefore it is light, is the conclusion. And the same for alamen, which always introduces the proslepsis, the second premise, but it is light, and therefore it is light, seem to be 2 different assertibles. It is light, and therefore it is light, one could think, are 2 different assertibles. And the same, but it is day, and it is day. So one question that is worth asking is, what are really the premises and the conclusions? There are 2 options here, I think. One, according to which ara and alamen are exactly what signals at the level of lexis the structure of the argument, but are not themselves part of the assertibles which constitutes the second premise and the conclusion. Another option is to say that ara and alamen are in fact part of the conclusion and of the additional premises respectively. The conclusion of an argument is not simply that something is the case, but that this follows from what has been assumed. One could even wonder whether therefore it is light is an assertibles outside of the context of a logos. Can we assert therefore it is light just out of the blue. And we assert, but it is they. Just as he, ekainos, he walks, where ekainos is understood as anaphoric, if propounded in a context in which there is nothing it is anaphoric to, we might wonder whether that would be an assertible, or this one walks with the deictic this, utos, cannot be meaningfully asserted without deixis or without the deixis being successful. You might wonder whether, therefore, it is light, is an assertable outside of an argument. I put on the handout some comments by Ada Bronowski, which I think partly go in this direction. She doesn't mention the role that Allaman and Ara have in the introduction of the assertibles. And I wouldn't want to go all the way where she wants to go, but I think that there are some things interesting that I won't discuss them here. We might go back to them in the discussion if you want. So all this raises some interesting questions, well, I hope interesting questions about the ontological status of Stoic arguments. Were arguments themselves conceived as essentially human constructs, the meaning or content of certain acts of thinking and speaking, which subsist only as long as those acts and their effects, certain inscriptions, utterances, thoughts prompted by them, exist in the world? Or were they entities which subsist independently of individual acts of arguing, thinking, or speaking, but subsist as far as there are rational beings able to argue? Or are even more thought or mind-independent entities, a very complex state of affairs, things out there in the world? Another way of thinking of the question is, are logoi things that are argued or arguables? What is the relation between a certain temporal episode or event in which we utter a certain sequence of sentences to assume something with a certain purpose, to establish something else, and the incorporeal logos, which is somehow the content or meaning or perhaps complex state of affairs signified by this argumentative activity? Were the Stoics themselves, or at least some of our sources, somehow conflating arguments, which are supposed to be incorporeal lecta, with specific acts of arguing, when they describe what premises and conclusions of an argument are, which give very much the idea that an argument is an argument if there is someone which is presenting it. In fact, so narrowly that it needs to be presented dialectically. The description in T5 and T6 could seem to favor some kind of strong mind dependency for arguments. Does this have any implication for lecta more generally? If arguments are lecta, and arguments are essentially mind-dependent entities, after all, perhaps all lecta are mind-dependent. Clearly, this would be an invalid inference, logically, but it could be taken to be a plausible abductive argument. An alternative way of thinking of this would be to say that whereas the lecta that compare the argument might be in some sense mind-independent, the same lecta qua components of the argument, namely qua premises and conclusion, are not. So if you think of a world in which there is an object made a wooden piece of wood, which is chair-shaped, it has not been created by any human being, is there a chair in that world? We may say, no, there is no chair. There is only a chair if and when a human being starts to use that as a chair. That doesn't mean that there isn't something there, a piece of wood with a certain shape, which is independent of human thought or human action. But per chair, that thing is a chair only if there are human beings around. thinking of it and using it as a chair. Is it something like this with lecta more generally as opposed to premises and conclusions of an argument? So if you go this way, we could say, well, perhaps we can have a kind of modal conception of what arguments are as mind independent. An argument is a self-complete lecton, itself a system of lecta. It is a lecton by saying which we can do something, we can argue. We can argue that certain things are the case and that something else must be the case too, because those things are the case. That would be an attempt to say, well, arguments are still mind independent, but in this kind of modal sense, there is still an essential connection to propounding and thinking and arguing. The text T8, which is from Sextus, points to the possibility that arguments might be there in some sense, even before anyone has ever thought of them. That just was a strong form of mind independence. This is not a narrowly anti-Stoic argument. It's a more generally anti-dogmatic argument that Sextus uses in his presentation of the modes. It's not explicitly dialectical, so we cannot really take it as such as evidence for Stoic thinking, but one can see how it could be applied or used against an interlocutor if that person adopted a certain interpretation of Stoic arguments as complex lecta, which subsist even when no one is thinking of them, or perhaps even if no one will ever think of them. Another way of articulating the kind of questions I've tried to, in a quite confused way, put on the table is the following. Are the relations of akoulouthia and make which govern the Stoic notions of conditional, disjunction, and validity through the principle of conditionalization fundamentally ontological relations in the same way in which, for example, causation is? Or are they purely logical relations? Does it even make sense to think of an argument as this very complex state of affairs, which consists in some kind of very complex relation of conflict or akoulouthia among things in the world? What would validity be? Would be the equivalent of other states, simpler state of affairs obtaining. But then what is the difference between validity and truth, if that is the case? So that was a way to introduce at least hopefully the idea that it might make sense to think a bit more about these questions, about the ontology of Stoic arguments. What I would like to do in the rest of the paper is to think of some arguments or some features of arguments, of Stoic arguments that we know of, and to ask the question as to how they fit this picture, whether we can learn something from them, whether they are compatible with any account of the ones I've described so far, or they point towards some interpretation or understanding rather than others. I won't have time today to go through all of them. You find on the handout on page 1 the list of the kind of things that I want to discuss: non-duplication, sub-syllogistic arguments, definitions and universals, ambiguity, perishing arguments, and changing arguments. Some of the things I'll say are very much interconnected with things that Ricardo and Marion and Jose were saying earlier on, but I will discuss them in a much more limited way from the point of view of the angle of the question that I'm trying to ask. I will skip non-duplication. You find on the handout a kind of short description of the kind of idea that I had in mind there. And I will move straight to sub-syllogistic arguments. One of the questions raised by the status of Stoic arguments as systems of incorporeal lecta is what are the criteria for identity of arguments. When are two arguments the same arguments? What makes distinct arguments two? Clearly, the criteria for identifying and counting arguments cannot be who propounds the argument, when or where or how or in what language. The whole point of Stoic semantics is to say that if yesterday I shouted aloud on my flight in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, "C'è giorno, c'è luce, mai giorno dunque c'è luce," and if Ricardo says now in this room in Mexico City, if it is day, it is light, but it's day, therefore it is light, we have propounded exactly the same argument. So when are two arguments two? When are two arguments actually one? Among the Stoic arguments which are conclusive but non-syllogistics, our sources mention a class of hyposyllogisticoi, sub-syllogistic arguments which are equivalent to the corresponding syllogisms, but not formulated in canonical syllogistic form. Galen and Alexander offer some kind of description of such arguments in T9 to T11. Only Alexander offers an example, and then we get another example for Diogenes Laertius in T12, even if Diogenes doesn't call the argument sub-syllogistic. Galen says, among the merely conclusive arguments, we have shown that some do not form a genus of syllogisms of their own, but are formulated in degenerate expression. And in the case of the arguments called sub-syllogistic, by being said by way of expressions which are equivalent with syllogistic arguments. Alexander says that this is the context of discussing two formulations of Barocco in peripatetic logic. He says, this is an argument of the sort which the more recent thinkers, which typically are the Stoics, in Alexander, call sub-syllogistics. It assumes something equivalent to the syllogistic premise and concludes the same from it. And he says what the two premises in Barocco are. And then he says, but they, and the more recent thinkers, deny that such arguments are syllogisms, since they look to the appearance and expression. Whereas Aristotle, who looks at the things themselves, the thing signifies, says that the same syllogism is conclusive when the expressions of the conclusion is transformed in this way, if the conjunction is in general syllogistic. And finally, we get in T11 an example of a sub-syllogism. So if P then Q, but P therefore Q is a syllogism in the form of a first indemonstrable. Q follows from P, but P therefore Q is a sub-syllogism, is not a syllogism. And Diogenes Laertius gives us another example, although it doesn't say, use the label. Not it is day and it is night, but it is day, therefore not is night. This is an example of an indemonstrable, third indemonstrable, so a syllogism. Whereas if we say it is day and it is night is false, but it is day, therefore not it is night, this is not syllogistic, is only sub-syllogistic. Alexander voices what had become a common refrain among the critics of the Stoics in late antiquity. They pay too much attention to the words and not enough to the things themselves. He seems to think that the Stoics believe that the syllogistic and the corresponding sub-syllogistic argument are understood by the Stoics to be two distinct arguments just because of their different forms of expressions, even if the two equivalence formulations of the first premise signify the same. This would saddle the Stoics with a conflation between lexis and lecta, which clearly the Stoics possessed all the tools to avoid. If two different arguments are expressed, sentences of the form if P then Q and Q follows from P must express different axiomata, even if somehow equivalent ones. On interpretation according to which assertibles, even non-simple ones, are state of affairs, and not linguistic meanings or intentions, this seems to be difficult to justify. This is just one single state of affairs. You might say that if P then Q, or that Q follows from P. One might be tempted by the idea that Alexander has misrepresented the Stoic position. In our example, it's not one and the same argument that can have, in our example, it is one and the same argument that can have two linguistic formulations. A syllogistic lexis, a syllogistic formulation, and a subsyllogistic one. And it is these two formulations that are equivalent exactly in the sense that they signify one and the same argument. After all, both Galen and Alexander say that the lexes are equivalent. Alexander also refers to the protasis, but the protasis in peripatetic logic would be more on the side of a linguistic item. And this interpretation has been favored by Barnes, and I think is implied by something that Morrison and Hierodekonos say. You find a quotation from all of them on the handout. I will not read them. So this would be a kind of lexical interpretation of sub-syllogism. There is a more robust way of understanding the distinction between syllogisms and sub-syllogisms, which would be more faithful to the Stoic classification, which says that these are, after all, logoi. They are specifically conclusive logoi, which are not, however, syllogistic logoi. According to this reading, what is sub-syllogistic is indeed certain logoi and not the lexes expressing them. On this interpretation, the different but somehow corresponding lecta, which constitute the relevant premises of the two logoi, are equivalent. So not the lexes, but the lecta are equivalent. But what does it mean that they use a dyname, if not that they have the same meaning? On the handout, you find suggestions which have been advanced first by Bobsin and then articulated more in detail by Ruge more recently, which suggests that this has to do with not meaning, but logical equivalence of a certain kind, which of course cannot be the kind of logical equivalence that you have in, let's say, Diodorian implication or co-implication. Must be something much more robust. So on this interpretation, what makes an argument sub-syllogistic is that one of the premises is different from the premises of a syllogistic argument, but has the same logical force. One way of thinking of it in the case of the two examples that we get from our sources, the kind of line that Bobsin advances is to say, although they're equivalent, actually you're saying something different, because when you say Q follows from P, you're making a meta logical point. You're talking about lecta and saying that one assertible follows from another. Whereas if you say if P then Q, you're saying something different. Of course, the two are equivalent in a very strong sense. You might say that in a way, P follows from Q is true exactly because if P then Q, but still they are different lecta. To conclude, sub-syllogistic arguments are an interesting illustration of the Stoic kind of desire to use the right kind of formulation, the right kind of language to describe how things really are. So not a mere interest in language as such, the kind of criticism that Alexander and others advanced, but something with the purpose of and in the service of clarifying what the logical form of what is presented is. The next section is about definitions and universals. We have covered much of this today. The passage T13 from Sextus has been quoted at least twice, I think, already today. From my point of view, what is interesting here is to ask the question again, what it means to say that the indefinite conditional and the universal Catholicon kind of definition, as let's say Aristotle or a peripatetic would phrase it, at the same dunamis. Here again, we have two options. To understand what this sameness in dunamis is, which are similar to the ones I have just described in the case of subsyllogisms. One could think that this means that we have the same lecton, which is expressed in two different ways. One would be to say that when I say if something is a man, that thing is a rational mortal animal, I'm expressing a different lecton from the lecton expressed by man is a rational mortal animal, but these two lecta are somehow logically equivalent. Either way, one could ask, why should the Stoic insist that we should use the formulation 1 star star and therefore use argument C? What lies behind the Stoic regimentation of language is this desire to manifest precisely what lecta has been expressed and the ontological structure of what is being referred to. One, man is a rational mortal animal, might incorrectly suggest that something is predicated of a certain generic or universal object, man, that's where the nobody sophism kind of come from. But for the Stoic, a universal is not something, as we have seen, a construct of the human mind, which neither exists nor subsists. Whereas if something is a man, that thing is a rational mortal animal, correctly displays the fact that to be a man is to have a certain common property, common quality, which the Stoic conceived as a corporeal. In addition, the conditional 1 star star lacks the existential import that the definition man is a mortal, rational mortal animal might appear to carry, and that the universal affirmation 1 star does carry in Aristotle logic. Universal affirmatives have existential import. So on one interpretation, although the two formulations might express the same argument, there are readings of 1 and 1 star as lexes that express a different assertibles than 1 double star, thereby making the arguments A and B different from the arguments C. And this is because we can say 1 and 1 star, unlike 1 double star, are somewhat ambiguous between two possible lecta. The conditional one, which is deprived of existential import, and let's say the peripatetic understanding of it. On the other interpretation, the problem is not that on some reading of them, the key premises express different assertibles, is that on some understanding of that assertible, the two assertibles do not have the same logical force. They are not equivalent. But does such an interpretation even make sense, since ambiguity for the Stoics is a matter of lexis? So to say that, in a sense, is the assertible itself which ends up being twofold or ambiguous might be problematic. And this leads us to section 6 of the handout, ambiguity. I will skip most of these. What I wanted just to draw the attention to is that because ambiguity for the Stoics is something which belongs to the realm of lexis, as showed by, for example, text T14, with the definition of amphibolia in Diogenes Laertius, by which amphibolia as the lexis duo semainusa. For the Stoics, there are no ambiguous arguments. There are only ambiguous formulations in a certain language to which two or more arguments might correspond. On the handout, I gave you an example of an argument based on the type of ambiguity, which is the twofold meaning of a single word, Andreas, discussed by Simplicius in T15. Andreas must mean poor man or courageous. So when you have the argument, the tunic is Andreios. What is Andreios as stout-hearted? Therefore, the tunic is stout-hearted. I call these E1, E2, and E3 because these are three expressions. These are three lexes. But to E1, there are two potential different lecta, which correspond A1A and A1B. The tunic is for man, or the tunic is courageous. And for E2, the same, we have two different lecta. What is for man is stout-hearted, and what is courageous is stout-hearted. So in the solution that the Stoics give to ambiguity, what we should do is to clarify what was meant by us as respondents, for example, who are trying to resist a sophistical employment of this argument by when we considered E1 and E2, and to show that the conclusion doesn't follow from the two lecta which we have considered. But if we ask the question, so what argument corresponds to E1, 2, 3? Is it the argument which is meant by the person who accepts the premises, who therefore will not even go to the conclusion, of course? Or there are multiple arguments for all potential combinations of the meanings of the lecta corresponding to the lexes, which are ambiguous, which are being expressed. How long do we have? Okay, so 5 to 10 minutes. Okay. So next section is on what I called parish arguments with a question mark. This relates to the fact that we know that for the Stoics there are some assertibles which perish, the ones that have a deixis which fails. The key text here is the 16 from Alexander. So a definite assertible, which is one containing the pronoun these plus deixis, is destroyed or perishes when the object of deixis no longer exists. For example, this one is dead, where putos is accompanied by deixis to dio is false at all times in which dio is alive and is destroyed at his death. So this raises interesting questions about the ontology of lecta as such. What does it mean for a lecton to perish? If lecta don't exist, but only subsist, we think of perishing or being destroyed as something which happens to existing things. What is for something which didn't exist to begin with to perish? Really, the idea is that they no longer subsist. But what does that mean? You could say, even if Dio has died, that this one has died, is this something that is there to be said, can be said, simply by pointing to someone else, if not to Dio. That would suggest that the Stoics didn't think so, would suggest that for the Stoics, clearly the lexis putos, peripatei, or well, in this case has died with deixis, signifies two different lecta if the deixis goes to two different objects. But one could still ask, in what sense the lecton which is signified by these lexis with deixis to someone who is actually dead as perished. On the kind of more mind-dependent view of what to subsist for a lecton is, you could say, well, this simply means that this thing can no longer be said by me, or if my act of saying is still there, or there is an inscription which is springing directly from that act of saying, that no longer has any lecton corresponding to it. If all this is the case, then one could ask the question, what happens to all arguments which might contain such a lecton? So I have the argument, if die is dead, this one is dead, not this one is dead, therefore not die is dead. Until die is alive, the argument is both valid and sound. You would think that after die's death, you still have a valid argument which now is unsound. The Stoic want to say no. In fact, the Stoic would have to say that we no longer have an argument at all, because we no longer have an additional premise, because an additional premise is a lecton, and not this one is dead is not a lecton according to the Stoics. So either you have no argument at all, because the Stoics thought that arguments need to have two premises, with the exception of antipater, or if you are antipater, you have an argument with just one premise and the conclusion, in which clearly the conclusion is disconnected and doesn't follow from the premises. Again, this might be puzzling, especially when we think of arguments from a formal point of view. After all, this is a very clear example of second indemonstrable. So to say that is not an argument and therefore is not valid might seem to be strange, but that seems to be the implication of the Stoic position. And finally, changing arguments. We know something about these arguments, and you find on the handout the main texts, which are T17 and T18, which offer evidence about them. This is another important test case when we ask the question, are arguments in any sense mind independent, or they are quite strongly dependent on someone using them in a particular circumstance, in a particular occasion. You find the argument on the handout on page 13. It is not the case both that I propounded something to you already and that it is not the case that the stars are even in number, but I have propounded something to you already, therefore the stars are even in number. This has the logical structure of third indemonstrable. Both premises, when agreed upon or accepted, are true, but by the time you accept the second premise, the first premise is no longer acceptable as true. Sextus says that the premise has become false, but Sextus is wrong. The premise is either false, or it might be true if in fact the number of stars was even. The problem is that we don't know. It's a completely unclear thing whether the number of stars is even. So this opens the question this and the diagnosis which is offered by Sextus and the different diagnosis which is offered by Titus raises again the question of what the argument really here is, whether it is this abstract set of lecta, which you can think of completely independently of acts of propounding them and accepting them and committing yourself to them, or whether the existence of such arguments in fact confirms the fact that arguments need to be understood in this more mind-dependent way. Once, and I gave you on the handout extensive excerpts from what he says about these in his in-depth discussion in the Logic and Imperial Stoa, wants to say that although the sources might give the impression that the Stoics conflate the two, or perhaps even that the Stoics have a view of arguments as events or things which are extended through time in the same way as acts of thinking and acts of expressing particular linguistic utterances clearly are extended through times, the Stoics had no confusion there. For the Stoics, arguments are simply set of lecta. In fact, here he says, without an order, there is the premises of an argument don't have an order. It doesn't even explain where it thinks that at least the conclusion should come last. I think these arguments actually give pause here, give us some pause to think again of the relation between propoundings, as Barnes calls them, and things propounded in the argument. And especially I think there is a way of thinking of what the solution to these arguments, which were used sophistically to embarrass the interlocutor, was. When Sextus says that the two premises do not synoparche, Barnes thinks that it means they cannot be true together, and then he thinks, well, Sextus is wrong. But that's not the way in which Sextus uses the terminology. Synoparchein is a question of coexistence of things. For example, he uses the same term when he says, in a conditional proposition, first you say the antecedent and then the consequent, they're never there together. So the whole conditional cannot exist because the antecedent and the consequent do not synoparche. So the question there is whether the items in a way exist or perhaps subsist together. On the handout, you also find argument T19, in which Sextus says that arguments in general cannot exist because their parts, in fact, do not synoparche. When you're finished presenting your first premise and you go on to the second, the first one is no longer there, and so on and so forth. If you think of this, you could say, well, what is the problem of the changing argument is not that it is unsound because the two premises are not true together. The problem is not even so much that the conclusion is not drawn in a kind of valid way from the premises. After all, the structure of the argument is the one of a third indemonstrable. The idea might be that there is no argument there, because as Galen says, by the time you have accepted the second premise, you are no longer committed to the first. It's a debt that you no longer have to pay. That's the kind of language that Galen says. But if you really, at the moment of drawing the conclusion, there are not two premises, because premises are things which are accepted by the person proposing the argument, or in a dialectical context by the person at least agreeing with the argument, then in a very important sense, the problem with these arguments is that there is no argument there in the end, because there are no two premises accepted. This would go along the same lines as text again T19, which sometimes is said to be indicating Sextus's confusion between signifier, something signified. He's treating the Stoic arguments as if they were not incorporeal sets of lecta, but sets of utterances. But if we think of the relation between the argument and the way in which it is expressed, then we think that the premises and the lecta which form the argument subsist only in correspondence to linguistic signifiers and thoughts, then the argument has some bite to it, because you need to start to explain in what sense you are still thinking or saying, expressing the whole argument at a single time, and not like Sextus says, well, the premises are gone by the time you draw the conclusion, so the lecta which subsist in correspondence with them perhaps might also have gone. But this leads us from the logic and ontology of arguments to the psychology of arguments, and that would be clearly a story for another day. Thanks.
Thank you so much, because there's so much in here that I will get a chance to talk about. I'm just going to start with a comment, and then I have a question that's related to the comment. I hope it's okay. The comment is on the perishing business.
Yeah.
And the first thing I want to say on that is that I don't think that perishing here has to be a sort of ontological claim. I think you can read it as just saying that it's no longer a proposition. So it's not even a claim about it not subsisting. There's a lecton that subsists, it's just not a proposition anymore. And I think there's a bit of a sort of misunderstanding of the example and how it works, which, if corrected, might not lead to the sort of the way that you apply it to the argument. Which is that if Don is dead, this one is dead. The claim is that that's impossible because this one is dead is either false or it doesn't subsist, right? So and the thought is you can look at the proposition as it's being said, like with reference to Dion. So you can consider the token, this one has died, with reference to Dion, and you can say that's false. What you can't do is sort of reiterate that assertion once Dion has died. You can't sort of refer to him again. But I take it you could say, even after he's dead, you could look at that argument and say that it's valid and sound. I think that the example will allow you to do that. But if not, you could still say, well, there's an argument there that's sound when Dion's alive, and after he's dead, there's no argument because there's no premises, because there's no proposition, and a premise has to be a proposition.
Yes.
And that's no more problematic than just saying that there's no proposition.
Yes,
that can be accessed.
Yes, that was my point. That this argument, well, this is no longer an argument. If after that's there. Yes. So.
But the argument uttered before he died, you can still look at that argument and say, that sound.
Yes. Yeah. So my question was. Isn't it strange that this thing that looks, well, it is clearly an instantiation of a third indemonstrable before Dion's death, ceases to be an argument and therefore to be valid after.
But I think it's not the same thing. So like, I think they speak a bit loosely when they say it ceases to be a proposition. There's the argument before Dion's dead, I think, can be thought to still be valid.
Yes, I see this in the sense that if you utter it again.
Yeah. But you can't. I mean, it's not that, it's just that you can't.
Well, you can utter the lexis and you say you have not presented an argument.
Well, you can utter this one is dead, but you're not going to refer, right? You can't refer to Dion after it's dead. So you can't actually, you can say the phone, but you can't express the same lecton.
Yes, exactly. So my point was exactly, isn't it strange that we have a set of lexes which correspond to an argument which in fact is valid and sound up to certain points, and then after that point, the same set of lexes fails to produce any argument if uttered again. Of course, retrospectively, you can still say back then the argument, I wasn't denying that, I was saying that this argument perishes in the sense that a new token, a new propounding of the same set of lexes happens now to be, in fact, no longer an argument, or in the best case scenario, to be an invalid argument with a single premise, if you think that you can have arguments with single premises.
I guess that doesn't.
Okay.
Because there's Dixis in there, and Dixis behaves in that way, right? So, yeah, I guess that doesn't strike me as strange. But
yes, my point was, my next move was to say, well, and that confirms that arguments are, for the Stoics, not these abstract logical forms. For example, when they speak of syllogisms of indemonstrables and they use the first, the second, or things like that, those are not arguments for the Stoics. Those are just tropoi. Arguments are always specific arguments, so that raises questions about whether we can even speak of logical form in the way in which we tend to speak about it. But there is a sense in which, and that's why I put those other examples which are with the term literary. I don't know what your view about that would be, but I think that that wouldn't be an argument either, because it contains words that has no, doesn't mean anything. So since literary doesn't mean anything, there is no lecton at all expressed by any of these.
Oh, no, there's a lecton.
There is no acceptable at all.
Yeah.
Well, what is the lecton?
It's some, I mean, I guess it depends what your theory of the structure of a complete lecton is, or even just like what you think the bits are. But at a minimum, you've said are made of gold. So I think you've expressed a predicate. You've not expressed a proposition, but I would think you've expressed a predicate. And you might not have expressed it. Yeah, you might not have asserted something, but you've expressed some like sort of gap, because literally hasn't expressed it.
So you think that you're always expressing all the parts of something even when?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So yeah, that was, I agree with the point that you made. So my point was just that I found strange what you don't find strange, or at least that shows something important about the fact that arguments in a way need not only to be specific in the sense that we have discussed, but then also specific and that the kind of signification that you want them, the individual part of the arguments to have.
Okay, very well. Alex.
Actually, asking you, I was going to ask precisely about the status of the descriptions that demonstrables and so on. So I think it's, you say they're not those statements and not those arguments.
Yes, they're not presented as, they're described as properly of arguments, I suppose, and then sometimes the Stoics would use some kind of mixed forms, it's called logotropy, in which they mix things like an actual assertable.
That's what I was kind of personally wondering now. So if I say, for example, if it is night, if it is light, it is day, the first, therefore the second, and then you often find it kind of thing. What is the status of that? Is that a subsyllogistic argument, or is it actually a perfectly bona fide abbreviation? The genuine argument?
I think is that would need to be taken as a kind of abbreviation of an argument, but in the sense in which an abbreviation of an argument is not an argument, so it's kind of alienance thing. An abbreviated argument is not an argument in the sense a logotropos is not the logos.
Thanks.
Would you like to answer?
No, I was also just wondering, because I suppose, strictly speaking, an utterance of if the first, second, it's quite hard for that. You can think of that expressed in axiom, but it doesn't really seem grammatically correct when you can have first.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. It's fascinating, really interesting. So yeah, I want to talk about or ask you a bit more. I was very intrigued by your discussion of the E13. Right. So, yeah, I think it's a really interesting question to raise. Why should the Stoic consist of a conditional formulation? So what's the whole point of the writers of the technical handbook saying you should use an indefinite conditional instead of the Aristotelian simple affirmative? Positive affirmative, sorry. Yeah, so I was looking into this actually, like trying to think about that question in general, because there is some cases where Chrysippus, not just Zeno and Cleanthes do it all the time, but Chrysippus too will use the Aristotelian universal when arguing, or he just won't use a quantifier at all. They'll just say the x is y, the y is z, etc. Therefore, the x is z. So I think one example is I found on the fine, he used arguments of this sort. the good is choiceworthy, and the choiceworthy is approved, and the approved is praiseworthy, and the praiseworthy is fine. And those are all just taught, taught this, taught that. And that's a Chrysippidon work. And then there's other cases where he just seems to mix. In De Facto, I think he uses both conditionals and all X or Y statements. So plainly, he doesn't. Chrysippus himself does not always deploy the formalization referred to in T13. And then there's another case that's interesting too. From when he's talking about ethics, right? He'll say it's okay if someone says preferred indifference are good and dispreferred indifference are bad. In certain contexts, we'll just spot them. That doesn't really matter. And he says it must be accepted that they're using the same semimena. So someone could say wealth is good and express wealth is preferred. So it looks like there's lots of cases where he's okay with a sort of looser lexical expression, and he's taking it moreover that the lexical expression refers to a lecton of the more precise form. Or at least that's what's going on in the preferred indifference passage. So I just wanted to say that in general because I think, it seems like that's a data point we have to take into account. And I think, it is maybe compatible with I think but I guess my point was I think maybe the use of semimena in the discussion of the preferred indifference passage looks like they are expressing the same proposition, just with different lexical expressions. And so the reason I'm saying that is, I think that does sort of maybe bolster the view that maybe what's going on in T13 is that we have different verbal expressions of the same lecton. But then I was curious, so the problem for Bobzine is that she wants to say with the subsyllogistic that there we have two different lexical expressions, which even though they're isodunamon, whatever, even though they're equivalent, they express different lecta. And so you're saying that's a little bit of a tension. Is that the diagonal move?
I wasn't putting the two things together, and I think it's possible to think that in the case of the subsyllogisms, the differences, in fact, in lecta. So it's the lecta that are at equal strength. Perhaps you can say that the lexes themselves has equal strength simply in the measure in which they express two different lecta, which are in fact which have equal strength. So I don't think we necessarily need to have a uniform kind of interpretation for the case of the universals and what is happening there in the case of the subsyllogisms. In fact, one thing that is clear, I put this on page 10 as questions. Would A and B count as subsyllogistic arguments? The answer is no. Because C is not a syllogism either for the Stoics. So it seems that subsyllogisms are very specifically the kind of arguments which, again, have some one-to-one relation to something that is a syllogism, but they're expressed in non-canonical form, or and that implies, at least in some cases, potentially that in fact the lecta forming them are different, even if logically equivalent.
I see. Okay, it's interesting. I think I totally agree with your assessment of that question.
But on your point about Chrysippus clearly sometimes does use these other forms. I think in a way it goes well with the idea that the problem is not that these other forms mean something which is itself false, but they are in some sense ambiguous. There is one lecton corresponding to them, which is in fact what the Stoics would think is correct, but then there is also dangerous false. or an helpful lecton, like in correspondence to man is a rational mortal animal, or something like there is a universal generic man and it is rational mortal. That would be false. But in certain contexts, there is no danger. It might be clear what is being signified when Chrysippus himself is using this. Or in the kind of ethical example that you were using, I think that the point that if the person who uses this word is using good to mean preferred indifferent, and clearly they know what the distinction between preferred indifferent and good is, or uses bad rather than this preferred, but clearly they know this, and this connects to the point that in the case of ambiguity, what lecton corresponds to your lexis is really determined by your thought, is speaker intention, which determines what the meaning of an ambiguous sentence is. They signify the correct thing, even if they use these words which are potentially misleading or might create troubles, because other people might take good and bad, perhaps in a more traditional, normal way, and therefore say something false or misunderstand what the person is saying. But that person's semine, because the signification of the lexis, in all cases, of course, but in the case of ambiguous lexis, importantly, to kind of select which of the lecta is being expressed is what is going on in the mind of the speaker. So if clearly they know the distinction and that's what they have in mind, it doesn't matter too much in that particular context that they say good when they actually mean preferred indifferent. I would go for that kind of explanation for why sometimes Chrysippus says, well, we can say that. The important thing is that we say that if we know what other things could be meant, which would be false or problematic by the same expression. And perhaps we would be ready in other contexts when something is at stake to use the precise expression to avoid problems.
Right. Yeah, I think that's great. I'm on the same page there. And I think maybe one passage that would maybe bolster that reading about, like, maybe not deceiving the people, but, not shocking them out of their customary ways. I think he says, like, when the sage is ruling, he speaks as if preferreds were goods. So, yeah, so like calm down the populace, but the sage really knows that wealth is immediately preferred, not good. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Yes. Yes, thanks a lot. That's very interesting and very positive points. So I just wanted to what the Stoics say. I just wanted to ask you about this idea of changing argument, right? Because, especially the example you take, which is, number 8, changing arguments. We have, it is not the case, but that I have heard something and so on and so on, which boils down that is, it's amounts following logical form that is not P and not Q, P, therefore Q. And so I'm puzzled that someone thinks that this doesn't follow. That is an invalid argument, right? But it could be an invalid argument because it's an instance of modus ponens, right? It's an instance of modus ponens because not P and not Q is equivalent to P and Q.
No, that's exactly a distinction that the Stoics want to make, the distinction between conditional and negated conjunction. That's why they have a separate indemonstrable syllogism with the negated conjunction. Because whereas the condition if P then Q expresses this kind of strong relation of following akoulousia between P and Q, or put it another way, a conflict between non-Q and P, the conjunction is purely plus functional. in fact, this is a good demonstration of the fact that by the time we have this, clearly the condition cannot be Philonian, because otherwise the third indemonstrable would be superfluous, would be redundant. So this is a case in which the only way in which you can decide whether to accept this negative conjunction is to take a position about the truth value of both conjuncts. And the problem here is, of course, because is negated and they formulate in this way, by the time in which premise one is presented, it's sufficient that you know that I propounded something to you already is false, to already know that the whole negative conjunction is true. So you can accept it independently of what you think about the number of stars. In fact, you will not be able to decide whether the number of stars is odd or even. But then the very same axioma, of course, becomes true. Again, here, when I say becomes true, it is not that that axioma in one somehow changes its value retrospectively. Is that this new proposal of 2 is now correct, accepted as true. But the point is, if we evaluated again the truth value of 1 now, that will now have become something that is not false, despite what Sextus says on Barnes's interpretation, but something which would have no reason to accept now, because we no longer have now we have one of the conjuncts which is true. So to decide whether the negative conjunction is true or false, we need to take the position on the second conjunct, which is the number of stars. And of course, we wouldn't be able to accept it, not because we think that is also false, but because we cannot commit to the truth of it, and we suspend judgment. So the point is that at the moment of drawing the inference, the person who has accepted 1 correctly as true before would no longer be bound to that acceptance and to the same commitment when drawing the conclusion, because of this particular feature of the argument. But not because that has become true, but because something that no one would have any way of assessing whether the whole negative conjunction is true or false.
That's why the order of premises is.
That's why the order of premises is crucial.
Yes. And I wanted to ask you something which is, well, I have 2 questions, but that time goes on. And one is this, is that the Stoics accept what is called in modern logic the proof by conditionalization. You refer to that. No? Proof by conditionalization is when you express an argument in the form of a conditional where the premises are the antecedent and even the consequent. And the argument is valid when the conditional is true. No? So if you succeed in demonstrating that the conditional is true, then you have to prove that the argument is valid. They do accept that. Other than, as you said, I was thinking of a passage in Severus PH. They say that they divide the logoi in synapticoi in asynapticoi. And the synapticoi, the conclusive ones, are those such that the conditional made in these terms is yes, sound. Sound, if I'm not mistaken, is true, no? For us. I mean, either both the antecedent are true, or the antecedent is also to the conclusion true. There too, you could have a yes and a valid argument, though on sound. But never mind. I mean, my point is this: is that given that this is possible for the Stoics, from a typological point of view, couldn't you say that arguments are a type of conditional, and that they fall within the genus that conditionals would be a genus of which arguments are species insofar as they are expressible or reducible? I don't know which is the right word there, which is important to conditionals, or why regard conditionals and arguments as different kind of no?
Yeah, I think probably the Stoics would want to say that the difference, although the principle of conditionalization is a way to assess the validity of the argument, an argument is not a conditional because in a conditional, the parts of the conditional are unasserted. Whereas when you they're not asserted. Whereas an argument is exactly about asserting and accepting two premises and then accepting as the result of the premises also the conclusion. So that's the key distinction between a conditional and an argument for the Stoics. But it's true that a way to ask the question is the argument valid is to see whether the conditional formed of the premises and the conclusion would be a true conditional.
Okay, thanks. And the other question is this, how do you, what's your position regarding the question discussed earlier and then which you addressed in your paper, the question of whether arguments are essentially human constructs or rather entities that subsist independently as human thought? Because you give this passage in Sextus Empiricus in T8, where he says something very striking. He says, before the founder of the school to which you adhere was born, the argument of the school, which is no doubt sound, was not yet apparent, although it was really there in nature. This can be interpreted as the assertion that the argument was there already. And the trouble is that we became aware of the argument, thankfully, but that it already was part of the ontology, and that even if the Stoics had never existed, the argument was could be there in the immense Platonic.
So I use that passage, although it's not again in any way directly related to the Stoics or representing a Stoic position, but to give a sense of what the view of a complete mind independence of arguments could be like. In the end, I have all these questions and I don't know yet what answer I want to give about the mind independence of arguments. I think starting this research has convinced me that if you want to ask this question and if we think is a useful question to ask, especially if you nuance it with various types or senses of mind dependence, it might be the case that we need to be specific, not just say, are Stoic lecta mind dependent or not? But there might be types of lecta which are perhaps and some which are not. Coming back to, you might see that perhaps predicables are mind independent in a quite strong sense, whereas argument are mind dependent. I still would want to go for a kind of modal kind of version by which that doesn't mean that arguments subsist only in correspondence and for the duration in which they're thought by a particular human being, but still are the kind of things that as part are defined intrinsically with reference to human activities of thinking, assuming, behaving, or doing things in contexts like trying to establish something, refute, or so on and so forth. So in a way, the kind of thing that in which a certain reading of what the classification of the complete lecta is doing, is putting them with reference to human activities like asserting, asking questions. You might think, well, clearly there is a sense in which therefore they're mind dependent, but perhaps we don't need to go all the way and say in the sense that they subsist just for that time, but in the broader sense that there need to be human beings, or at least a rational mind, which might be the mind of God or other rational beings, for us to be able to even speak about these things. So in a world in which there is no intelligence and no agency and no agent, it wouldn't make sense even for the Stoics to say, but there are arguments which are there and could be argued, whereas there are effects or predicates which are the effects of certain causal mechanisms which would be there even in a reality without human beings or even a god, perhaps. I don't know whether this kind of pick and choose strategy and say, well, some lecta behave in certain ways and some others not, is acceptable or promising. But if that wasn't the case, then I would probably say that there are so many examples of lecta, especially the more complex you go, in which this reference to the human mind and human thinking is there, that I would then want to push for a kind of weaker or quite generous view of mind dependency, rather than say, no, because some lecta are clearly completely mind independent. Everything, including arguments or demonstrations, are kind of things which exist in the world independently of the existence of rational being.
I mean, it's sort of related. Just a clarificatory question, and I'm sorry if the jet lag is making me not able to follow, but on page 5, you sort of raise these questions about whether the Stoics are conflating the arguments with a specific speech act or specific acts of arguing. And I guess it wasn't obvious to me why that worry arose out of the evidence that you had leading up to that point.
Yes, I think the idea that the premise is something assumed with agreement of by yourself, or in fact, your direct interlocutor, where there is no modal language at all. A premise is something that has been accepted.
And
you can still say, well, even if that is the kind of a counter premise, you can still distinguish the content of what has been accepted from the act of accepting. But the conflation would be in the sense that there is no potential talk about the content independently and over and above specific acts. I think that was the point.
Well, we'll leave it to you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And so, I think it's